getting the thumbs up, so I assume that means it's time to go. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this year's Ludcke Lecture. Last year, we were spoiled with not one, not two, but 3 Ludcke Lectures as we worked our way through the backlog of pandemic delays. We were treated to talks from the environmental sciences, from mathematics, and I see Craig is here tonight. Hi, Craig. And literature, and I see Jennifer is here tonight as well. So we have 2 of last year's lecturers with us tonight, which is wonderful. I pointed out because tonight we stay within the humanities with David's talk, and I'm extremely proud of the breadth of scholarship from across the disciplines in the College of Arts and Sciences. While we may be best known for our footprint in the STEM disciplines, the true scope of our world-class scholars is comprehensive throughout the arts and sciences. The Ludcke Lecture, founded by a generous bequest from the estate of Eleanor Ludcke from the 1926 class of the Westbrook College, is presented annually to a tenured member of the faculty of the College of Arts and Sciences in recognition of their outstanding accomplishments as a teacher and scholar. The chairholder must be a dedicated educator and productive researcher who has given generously of their time to UNE over a significant period of time, and David is just that. David is a professor of philosophy in the School of Arts and Humanities, and he earned his Ph.D. in philosophy in 1996 at the University of London King's College, and he joined UNE in 2001. He is a prolific author of 9 books and the editor of 1 collection of papers by leading philosophers of biology. One of his books, Less Than Human: Why We Demean, Enslave, and Exterminate Others, received the 2012 Annis Feld-Wolf Award for Nonfiction, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. In 2020, David published In Humanity, Dehumanization and How to Resist It, and in 2021, he published Making Monsters, The Uncanny Power of Dehumanization. In addition to his 9 books, David has published numerous articles, given many conference presentations, public lectures, and has been interviewed by so many media outlets that each quarter when I do my unit report, I think there's 3 pages alone just to David's interviews and public presentations. Tonight, please join me in welcoming David as he gives his talk titled Real Horror, the Power and Peril of Dehumanization. David?
Thank you, Jonathan. I guess I should bring it up a little bit, huh? So, I've been working on this subject, dehumanization, for almost 20 years now. And when I first got into it, must have been, around 2005, there was hardly any literature on this. In fact, there were no books in the English language on this. Well, I kind of fixed that. My first book on dehumanization, Less Than Human, came out in 2011. And my second in 2020, as Jonathan said, and finally my third in 2021. These constitute approximately half of the books in the English language on dehumanization. So what I want to do today is try in a reasonably timely manner to run you through the way I conceive of and the way I theorize the phenomenon of dehumanization. Now that will be a little bit challenging because, as I said, I've been working on it for 20 years. And there are a lot of bells and whistles. There have been a lot of changes over time. There have been a lot of subtleties introduced. So I'm going to do my best, but obviously there will be things that get missed by this. Perhaps some of these things will come up in conversation after. So, dehumanization is a contested concept. Almost all of the research literature on dehumanization, and I mean like 99% of it, is in social psychology. That literature in social psychology, dehumanization itself is theorized in at least 2 major ways that are contradictory. I have a lot of problems with that literature. That's why I do what I do. I have to tilt my head over here to see what's going on. Okay. So, in fact, when I first started getting into wanting to figure out what was going on in dehumanization, I, of course, pursued that literature in social psychology, which has been going since about the year 1999. I was really dissatisfied for all sorts of reasons. So in addition to what the social psychologists are doing, there are others who are skeptics about dehumanization, who think that dehumanization isn't something real. I'm not one of those either, obviously. What haven't I covered here? Oh, I haven't covered the most important bit. So look, if you were to Google the word dehumanization, you would get something like, I think it's probably up to around 25 million hits right now. And if you were to investigate these hits, you would find the following. The word is used in all kinds of different ways. And if you just confined yourself to the scholarly literature, you would find something similar. You would find that there are 8 or 10 different uses of the term, many of which contradict one another. So it's really, really important at the start of a presentation like this to be very clear about what one means. It's not that there's one right account and all the others are wrong. It's just that the word has accumulated a number of different meanings in its history. So here's what I mean, and these words are chosen very, very carefully. Dehumanization is the attitude of conceiving of others as less than human creatures. So what that means is, if you attend to the language, I understand dehumanization as a psychological phenomenon, as something that happens in people's heads. Although it can't be understood, I'll add this, entirely psychologically. This is where the social psychologists go wrong, actually. Because we have to look at the social and political environment that people's heads are in order to understand dehumanization. Dehumanization is a psychological response to social and political forces. I use the term creature. I didn't say animal, I said creature. That's important too, because as I will articulate, in the most dangerous, the most toxic, the most destructive forms of dehumanization, the dehumanized other is not simply seen as a rat or a louse. The dehumanized other is seen as a monstrous, uncanny, demonic being, an embodiment of evil. Okay, so why study dehumanization? Well, here's one reason. This is a quotation from a man named Eleanor Ludcke in an interview with Daniel Goldhagen, political scientist. Ludcke was a perpetrator in the Rwanda genocide of 1994. This is his testimony. I'll rather than, I can take this out and walk, right? Okay, well, that makes life a lot easier. What he said was this. They did not know, he's referring to the radical Hutus who were perpetrators of the genocide. A genocide, by the way, in which approximately 800,000 people were killed in the space of 3 months. They did not know that the Tutsi were human beings, because if they had thought about that, they wouldn't have killed them. Let me include myself as someone who accepted it. I wouldn't have accepted that they were human beings. I can't explain it. The only answer I can give is that it was like being in a fog, something like a darkness. So he's saying at the end there that he was in some peculiar state, altered state of consciousness. Now there are questions to be asked about testimony like this, of course. But I think we should take his words at face value. I think we should take them immensely seriously and make an effort, as I've done, to try and unpack that condition of being in something like a darkness. So, this is the Rwanda genocide, but you can take any genocide over the last, 150 years, and there have been, unfortunately, very many, including several unfolding right now as we sit here in this room, and find this sort of phenomenon. It is typical of genocidal violence that perpetrators characterize, represent those who they are attempting to exterminate as non-human beings. So genocide, yes, but stuff short of genocide, or maybe not. This is in the last month. The Israeli Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, stating, "We're fighting human animals, and we are acting accordingly." Now, when I read his words, I was very, very concerned, particularly by his particular choice of words, you see. He didn't say we're fighting animals. He didn't say we're fighting people who've done terrible things. He said we're fighting human animals, and the significance of that will emerge as we proceed. And in a piece I wrote about this, actually, when it first became public, what I said was, this is tantamount to saying we're fighting monsters. Lo and behold, within a couple of days, Netanyahu said precisely that. We're fighting monsters, bloodthirsty monsters. And a little closer to home, very recently in the news, Trump's most fascistic speech yet. We pledge to you, I wish I could do an impersonation of Trump, but we pledge to you that we will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country. That could have been Berlin, 1933. So I want to organize this talk around a series of 5 puzzles. Because let's face it, dehumanization is weird. So I want you to take what I said about it, my account of it, very seriously, that if you were to be dehumanizing me, you would see me, you would understand me, you would conceive of me as a subhuman creature. And the first puzzle is, how is it possible to do that? How is it possible to conceive of members of our species as non-human entities? So let's play a little game. Let's pretend you're all Nazis. Hopefully none of you are, but who knows? This is United States, 2021, and I'm a Jewish guy. Evidence here. So you look at me, and you've really swallowed it. You swallowed the ideology. And you look at me, and you think of me as an Untermensch, a subhuman. Now, how does that work? I mean, I'm bipedal, I speak your language, I speak a language, I wear clothes, I do everything. I do talks. I do everything that would place me, at least superficially, in the same category as anyone who you would characterize as a human being. So let's address the first puzzle. Anyone have an idea what's going on in this picture? It's a pretty strange picture. If my students were here, they'd raise their hands immediately. That's a 14th century painting. The 2 guys standing there are Jews. We can tell from their attire and their beards. And that little round thing on the table is a sacramental host, the wafer that one eats when one takes communion. And it's bleeding. One of them is stabbing the host, and the host is bleeding. Now, what's the explanation of that? In the year 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council of the Roman Catholic Church, it became official doctrine that the host is literally the body of Christ. Not metaphorically, literally. And once that happened, there were these conspiracy theories that developed that Jewish people then stole these wafers and tortured them by boiling, by stabbing, by putting them in their shoes and walking on them, as a way of murdering Christ all over again. And this led, of course, to massacres and expulsions and so on. Now, this is very strange, isn't it? I mean, when I say the wafer was literally the body of Christ, a wafer looks nothing like a first-century Palestinian Jew. There's absolutely no resemblance. So how could that be? Well, the intellectuals got together and they said, it may look like a wafer, but on the inside, its essence is the body of Christ. So the philosophers of the era made a distinction between the appearance of a thing and its essence, what it really is. We can understand that now because there's a very interesting and robust subdiscipline in psychology, which was initiated in 1989, which is the study of what became known as psychological essentialism. The term was coined in '89 by two psychologists who wrote a paper titled Psychological Essentialism. And the idea was this, that we human beings have a disposition, have a tendency to carve the natural world up into kinds of things that are sharply demarcated from one another. So, if we had the periodic table of the elements in this room, that's a paradigmatic example, which actually does work. But the more common example are biological species, right? So we carve the natural world into these types that are sharply demarcated. And this, cognitive anthropologists have found that people do this the world over in more or less the same way. The essentialist bit comes in with the idea that what makes any individual belong to one of these types, these categories, these kinds, is not how it appears, but what it is on the inside. That there's a mysterious something, the essence, which makes a dog, and a cat, and a giraffe, and so on. A human being, a human being. Now, here's something really important about psychological essentialism. It allows that the appearance of a thing can come apart from its essence, what it really is. Just as, consider a $20 bill. It looks, if it's a good $20 bill, it's a real $20 bill. But what about a counterfeit $20 bill? Well, it looks exactly, if it's a good counterfeit, like a $20 bill. But it isn't one. Its appearance belies what it really is. Now, we're not essentialists about $20 bills. They're artifacts. Essentialism applies only to what we philosophers call natural kinds. But this disjunction, this possible disjunction between what a thing is and how it appears, well, we just saw that with the Jews stabbing the sacramental host. The host appears to be a host, but what it really is Jesus. So similarly, to return to our little game, if y'all are dyed-in-the-wool Nazis, and you look at me and you see someone that looks like a human being, it is perfectly possible for you to think that, yeah, he looks like a human being. That's mere appearance. But what he really is on the inside is something different, something non-human. So that bit of psychological theory is really, really helpful for dealing with the first puzzle. There are 2 points at the bottom here which are important, so put them on the back burner. The array and order of natural kinds is supposed to describe the natural order, the order of things. anything that violates that is therefore understood as unnatural. Not artificial, unnatural. Unnatural, the notion of unnaturalness has this normative quality, something disturbing about it. We'll see why. Oops, come back. So a couple of examples which show how easily this way of thinking comes to us. The first is the Bela Lugosi's Dracula. 1932, I think that film came out. We can apply it to any vampire film. Think about it. The vampire in vampire movies looks human, but isn't really human. We don't have any problem with that. You know, watching a movie, we don't puzzle over that. It just seems fairly straightforward because of our psychological dispositions to essentialize. The other picture is from a film of The Midsummer Night's Dream. That's Nick Bottom. You see the disjunction between appearance and reality again. His appearance is of a weird, hybrid donkey man, but we know he's a human being. Okay, so I think I'm going to switch hands here. So that gives us an explanation of how you can take a being that is outwardly indistinguishable from a human being and conceive of them as non-human, as really non-human. But that doesn't give us an analysis of subhumanity. Subhumanity requires a different dimension. And as studied as psychological essentialism has been in psychology, and there's really a large literature now, what I'm getting into next is so understudied. When I'm talking to psychologists, I say, here's a great project for you. Get onto this. Subhumanity, the idea of subhumanity, requires hierarchical thinking. Just the word sub tells us that, with the idea that someone is less than human. There's higher and there's lower. So this, I think, is also a feature of our psychology, and I think I know why. It's kind of a solution to a problem that I call the problem of killing. I'm not going to get into this right now. So the idea is this. The world is arranged as a hierarchy of value with each natural kind assigned a rank. The higher a kind is ranked on the hierarchy, the greater is its intrinsic value, its value in and of itself. Anything ranked below the human is thus subhuman or less than human. To dehumanize others, then, is to attribute to them the essence of a kind ranked below the human. Now, it's very important to understand that neither essentialism nor hierarchical thinking is consistent with the picture that biology gives us of the natural world. Right? These ideas are robust. We could call them cognitive biases. I prefer the term folk metaphysics, but they are not scientifically respectable. But despite that, they're persistent, even among biologists. There was a wonderful study by 2 Italian biologists who went through the journals looking for evidence of hierarchical thinking, and they found it. They found it was remarkably pervasive, including, counterintuitively, journal articles in the chief journal on molecular biology. It's like, whoa. Okay. That's wrong direction. Right, so this is an illustration of the great chain of being. This was a conception of the cosmos, a hierarchical conception of the cosmos. And this one is from the 16th century. And you see what we have. We have God at the top, perfectly perfect, and then archangels, and then angels, and then human beings. We modestly place ourselves just just below the angels, and then various sorts of animals, plants, etc., lower and lower and lower and lower. There's one classic study of this idea, published in the 30s by a historian of ideas and philosopher named Arthur Lovejoy. And Lovejoy claimed that this was cobbled together in antiquity from ideas from Plato and Aristotle, enjoyed a career through the Middle Ages, and died out with the rise of biological science in the late 18th and early 19th century. And therefore was distinctly European. That's not right. If you look, you find this kind of hierarchical model all over the world, and it certainly hasn't died out. It's still part of our moral psychology, even though it's scientifically unrespectable. So, you know, you swat a fly or you boil a carrot, right? Well, how could you take the life of that carrot or that fly? Well, it's just a carrot, it's just a fly. That's hierarchical thinking in action. And if you think that through a little bit, then you get a hint of why I said the rationale for this is the problem of killing. Life feeds on life. And we've got to kill or dismember something to live. Okay, but just to show you, oops, I'm right-handed, you see. The persistence. This is a diagram from a 19th century biology textbook by Ernst Haeckel, who was the most distinguished biologist in Germany during that period. And it purports to show the tree of life with the various taxa differentiating. But look at it, it's hierarchical. God has died now. We've already had Nietzsche. So man is at the top, and it goes down, 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 down. It's a hierarchical conception of nature. So, like I said, first pass theory of dehumanization. To dehumanize others, we attribute to them the essence of a kind of thing that's lower on the hierarchy than the human. Let me illustrate this with two examples. Historically and geographically dispersed. The first, I'm going to go back here for a second. Just do it this way. So the first is a text published in 1680 by a remarkable man named Morgan Godwin. Godwin, he was a clergyman. He studied with John Locke at Oxford, and then in the plague year 1666, if memory serves me correctly, sailed for Virginia. And his project in Virginia was to baptize enslaved Africans and Native Americans. Now, he really concentrated on enslaved Africans, and that was very controversial because in those days, there was some uncertainty about whether it was permissible to enslave Christians. So there was a big investment in not baptizing black people. So this book, the Negroes and Indians advocates suing for their admission to the church, or, you know, blah, 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 these 17th century titles go on a full page, was written not in Virginia. In fact, he made himself so unpopular in Virginia that he left and sailed to Barbados. Barbados was the most, well, it was the wealthiest of the British sugar colonies in the Caribbean, an extremely brutal place. It was his experiences in Barbados that led him, pardon me, to write this. And it's a fantastic book. It really is a fantastic book. He talks about the atrocities perpetrated on Africans. He talks about their sexual abuse, and he brings out some really great arguments against attempts to justify these things. Oops, sorry again, I'm not getting this. The other text I want to use is this tasteful little number, published by the SS Publishing House under the editorial supervision of Heinrich Himmler in 1941, Der Untermensch, the subhuman. And what I want to do is juxtapose quotations from these two texts. 20th century Germany, and I think Godwin wrote that piece when he got back to England. Just by the way, he was very probably assassinated for preaching against slavery, because the King of England was like the CEO of the Royal Africa Company, which was in charge of the slave trade. He gave in 1685 this incredible sermon in Westminster Abbey, saying in the sermon, "I'm taking my life in my two hands." He gives it a couple more times, then he disappears from history. The speculation is they had him killed. So there's Godwin, there's Himmler, and let's start with Godwin. Now, it's important to understand that he's reporting here. He doesn't believe these things. He's reporting on what was said to him. The Negroes, though in their figure they carry some resemblances of manhood, yet are indeed no men. So here we have the essence-appearance dichotomy. They look human, but they're not really human. Himmler, or der Untermensch anyway. Not all of those who appear human are in fact so. Woe to him who forgets it. This was a very popular Nazi slogan, and as far as I can determine, it was introduced by Carl Schmitt, the Nazi jurist and political philosopher, and it really caught on. It was based on an older German proverb pertaining specifically to Jews. Back to Godwin. Africans are creatures destitute of souls, to be ranked among brute beasts and treated accordingly. So there we have the hierarchical element, the ranking. And not to be outdone, although it has features similar to a human, the subhuman is lower on the spiritual and psychological scale than any animal. That's actually significant when it says lower, not at the same level, lower. Jews are beasts in human appearance. So we have both elements working there. So I trust that is at least suggestive to you, that there's something going on here. You might say, oh, it's cherry-picked. Of course it's cherry-picked. It's for illustrative purposes. But if you go through the literature, the historical literature expressing dehumanizing attitudes, you can find many, many, many statements of this sort. Third puzzle. Why do dehumanizers implicitly or explicitly characterize those whom they dehumanize as human as well as subhuman? All right, let's go back here for a second. Let me unpack that. So if you look at the actual examples in genocides, in apologies for slavery, and so on, what you see is really interesting. Dehumanizers describe those who they dehumanize not simply as less than human animals. They also implicitly or explicitly describe them as human beings, often in the space of a single sentence. And that's led some thinkers, notably Kate Mann at Cornell University, a philosopher, to say, well, so dehumanization isn't really a thing because, look, we have evidence that the dehumanizer sees the dehumanized as human. So dehumanization, or ostensible dehumanization, must simply be a way of degrading the other person, of humiliating them, of bringing them down, and so on. I don't think that's a warranted conclusion for reasons that will become clear. And I want to illustrate this with an example. Oops, boy, I keep getting this one wrong. This is from the 1993 Hadareni pogrom. A pogrom is, of course, a massacre or attack on a community, an ethnic minority community. And Hadereni is a town in Romania. What happened in Hadereni was there were a number of Roma people living there. And a Roma guy got into an altercation with one of the local Romanians or Hungarians, there are a lot of Hungarians living there. He stabbed him. The Roma guy fled into his house. Actually, he had a partner there. They both went into the house. A mob gathers of 500-600 people, and they set the house on fire. One of the men flees, is clubbed to death. The other is burned alive. I think there was a third who was also killed. Then the mob went around and burnt down 13 Roma houses and ransacked a couple more. So this woman, Maria, who was with the mob, gave an interview to a reporter from the British newspaper, The Independent. And here's what she said. On reflection, though, I'll take this up again. On reflection, though, it would have been better if we had burnt more of the people, not just the houses. We did not commit murder. How could you call killing gypsies murder? Gypsies are not really people. Now, do you notice the contradiction? They're people and they're not really people. You see? They're always killing each other. They're criminals. Well, let's pause with that. Criminal implies humanness, right? There aren't any criminal lice or cockroaches or rats. It's a term that is exclusively applied to human beings. Next words, subhuman. They're not human anymore. And vermin. So you see how she goes back and forth between these contrary characterizations of these people who were killed and persecuted. Which button is it? It's this one. No, it's this one. Now, I'm going to move very quickly from that puzzle to the fourth puzzle, because the third and fourth puzzles have a common solution. Why is it that dehumanizers often characterize those whom they dehumanize as monstrous or demonic entities? So I want to make it clear why that bites. So remember my first characterization of dehumanization. It's the attribution to a person, or really, in fact, a group of people, the essence of a kind lower on the natural hierarchy. In other words, a less than human animal. But monsters aren't on the hierarchy. Demons aren't on the hierarchy. They are, by definition, unnatural creatures. So that first characterization of dehumanization, which was the characterization of my first book on the subject, doesn't cover these really important cases. Which button is it? It's this one. Okay, so we got to look at monsters. This is a still from the 1941 movie, The Wolfman. 1941, what was going on? Oh yeah, World War II was going on. And that's important. This was a pretty successful film for its era. I can't get it. It was written, the screenplay was written by this man, Kurt Siademak. Now, Siademak was a Jewish refugee from Germany. He fled Germany when Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda, proclaimed that writings by Jews would not be published anymore. He goes to various European countries and ends up in Hollywood, where he became well known as a screenwriter for mostly really crappy, low-budget horror films. You know, Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, stuff like that. Now, the film is really interesting because it contains allusions easily interpreted as references to the fate of Jews in Europe. For instance, the werewolf is marked by a star. It's not the Mogen David, the 6-pointed star, it's a 5-pointed star, but it's close enough. The first werewolf is a Roma man in the film. In the original version of the screenplay, the lead character who becomes the werewolf, and the werewolf is a sympathetic character, goes back to Germany, and that's the scene of the action in Germany. That was changed. But we don't have to rely on these things because we have an interview with him right towards the end of his life where he stated, "I am the Wolfman. I was forced into a fate I didn't want to be a Jew in Germany." He also said in that film, the full moon is the swastika and other stuff. So Siadnamak had the experience of being thought of as a monstrous being. And if you have any doubt that this was part of Nazi anti-Semitism, just look at the propaganda. It's really quite explicit. Jews are dangerous, monstrous, demonic beings. And that comes from a long tradition in European thought, goes back to the High Middle Ages. Which one is it? It's this one. Now, looking at it from the other side, here's some Nazi propaganda. The first one, the one on your left, is a Danish poster, and the text reads, "Rats destroy them." Now, let's pause with that for a moment. What do we see here? We see a strange chimera with a rat's body and a Jewish man's head. And this creature is looking out of its hole at Denmark. Now, it's not just a rat, right? So, like, you might have all kinds of attitudes to rats. You might love them. You might be terrified of them, as my grandmother was, because she grew up in a rat-infested slum. There are a variety of possibilities, but I can assure you, if something like that came into the room, I think you would react in unison that this is something horrific. The other side of the slide is a piece of Nazi propaganda. And again, we have the rat theme, but again, we have a chimera. The rat is standing upright, wearing clothes, human-like body, rat's head, dripping blood out of the mouth, and it says, "Der Jude tarnt sich," the Jew disguises himself. So, both in the propaganda, Jews are characterized as monstrous beings, and this sort of coincides with the experiences of at least one man, Kurt Siadnamak. What do you think's going on here? This famous photograph. Any idea? It is. Waco, Texas. What's happening is a lynching. So if your picture of lynchings comes from TV shows and movies, you are misinformed. The picture you'll get from TV shows and movies is half a dozen Ku Klux Klan guys ride up, grab a black man, string him up from a tree. In reality, lynchings almost always involved bodily mutilation and torture. And often the death wasn't by hanging, it was by burning. Many lynchings were public events, and this is one of them. This is 1893, Waco, Texas. The crowd is somewhere between 15 and 20,000 people, it's approximated, coming to see the lynching. The man on the platform, well, there are three men on the platform. One is the victim, a man named Henry Smith, who was a cognitively disabled black farm worker who was accused of raping and murdering the sheriff's child. He was apprehended, allegedly confessed. Allegedly, there's reason to think that he didn't. And this event was announced. These large public lynchings, called spectacle lynchings, they were public, they were announced, they were in the newspaper. The media was there, that's why we have a picture. Reporters were there from newspapers. Pictures like this, by the way, were sold as postcards. Schools were closed, there's men, women, and children watching, saloons were closed, railway companies made an extra buck by putting on extra trains to transport people to the site of the lynching. And what happened to this guy was, first he was paraded around town on a carnival float dressed as a king. Then he was taken to the platform, his clothes were ripped off, and iron pokers were rubbed up and down his body. And then his eyes were gouged out using those same red-hot iron pokers. And then he was placed on a mound of cotton hulls and burnt to death, and burnt slowly, and burnt in such a way that he would not die of asphyxiation, like they did, in the Middle Ages to heretics, and a little bit later to those accused of witchcraft. Then the crowd pressed in to take souvenirs, bits of bone, bits of crisp internal organs, and none of this was unusual. Right? There were around 4,400 recorded lynchings in the United States. Probably many more went unrecorded, and many were of this nature. Have I shut it off now? There we go. Okay. So when you see something like that, when you hear about something like that, you think, well, how could anyone do that to another person? Part of my method is to go through the old newspapers and look at how the victim is described. And here's a selection. Incarnate monster, unnatural monster, the most inhuman monster known in current history, fiend incarnate, monster in human form. And, you could go on and on with these things. And not just in the newspapers, but in the racial literature of the day. Which one is it, David? Is this one? Yes. Okay, so I trust that you're somewhat convinced that monsterization, at least sometimes, plays a role in dehumanization. Why? Or rather, how? Funnily enough, there is an academic subdiscipline called monster theory. It's mostly people in literary studies and film studies and so on. But I'm particularly influenced by a philosopher who's involved in this, a man named Noel Carroll, who wrote a really, really good book called Philosophy of Horror. And unlike most philosophy books, it's not boring. It's actually really interesting. One of the questions that Carroll asks is what makes a monster? Like, what's the job description of what he calls a horrific monster? The monsters that appear in horror fiction and horror cinema, and so on. And they have to have two characteristics. One is straightforward, the other is less so. The one that's straightforward is the monster has to be physically threatening. Monsters aren't nice. They're out to get you, they're out to kill you, they're out to destroy you. But that's not sufficient, is it? Because there are lots of physically dangerous entities that are not monsters by any stretch of the imagination. They also have to be what I call metaphysically threatening, what Carroll calls cognitively threatening. A metaphysically threatening thing is a thing that seems to transgress the boundaries between mutually exclusive natural kinds. They are experienced as creepy, uncanny, because they seem to subvert the natural order. I can't get this right a single time. I think this is brilliantly described by the horror fiction writer Arthur Machen from his book, The House of Souls. What would your feelings be, seriously, if your cat or your dog began to talk to you and to dispute with you in human accents? You would be overwhelmed with horror. I'm sure of it. And if the roses in your garden sang a weird song, you would go mad. And suppose the stones in the road began to swell and grow before your eyes, and if the pebble that you noticed at night had shot out stony blossoms in the morning. So all these examples are violations of these metaphysical categories. Roses don't sing, dogs don't talk in human accents, pebbles don't grow like plants. Here's an example. Hyper-realistic sculpture, which is a hybrid, right? It's a violation of our conception of separate natural kinds. And I don't know about you, but I find this very disturbing. But it's not clear exactly why. Now, this is a work of art, but exactly the same notion of hybridity has been used politically. And here's the example. Am I going to get the right button this time? Yes. This is from the 12th century. This is an image known as the Judensaal. It was an image that decorated numerous public buildings and churches. And what it is a hybrid pig Jew. In this example, you see it's a pig's body and the piglet suckling with a Jewish man's head. And a very common theme was a Jewish person gazing into the anus of the pig. Same idea. So, as I said, monsters have to be both physically and metaphysically threatening. Zombie is one of my favorite examples of a metaphysically and physically threatening entity. Not Haitian zombies, movie zombies. So what makes the zombie physically threatening? Well, it wants to eat you. That's pretty physically threatening. What makes it metaphysically threatening? The zombie is dead and alive at the same time. The zombie is a decaying corpse, but it's a corpse with a metabolism. It wants to eat you, and it walks around. It's this combination, this impossible combination of kinds, in this case, dead things and living things, which elicits the response of metaphysical threat. This, too, has been used politically. This is a Ukrainian recruiting poster. The guy on the left is a Ukrainian soldier, probably from the Azov Brigade, and those zombies on the right are representations of Russians. The text, by the way, reads, "Join the brigade." Okay, now, perhaps you're relieved at this. I've been going on a while. We're at the fifth puzzle. Why are dehumanized people seen as human and subhuman, and how does this transform them into monsters? Now, here's my view on this matter. There's something really interesting about human faces. Ask any neuropsychologist, and they will tell you that brains process human faces differently than they process anything else, particularly from the middle of the nose up. It's a very, very powerful stimulus. Now, here's a fact about our species. We are what biologists call ultra-social mammals. There is no mammal that comes remotely near to our degree of sociality. In fact, to get anywhere near that, you have to go to the eusocial insects, ants and bees. But obviously, our lives are a bit more complicated than theirs. Here's a fact about social animals. They must have inhibitions against lethal violence, and even sublethal violence, against members of their own communities. This is mediated biologically in various ways. So for instance, ants, it's done with chemical signals. And it's obvious why. You cannot maintain a social way of life if you're killing each other. Human beings, being ultra-social, have to have extraordinarily powerful inhibitions against this sort of violence. And human beings have a very extended notion of community. We know that. We know, for instance, that deep into prehistory, human beings were trading with one another, groups were trading with one another at remarkable distances. So, unlike many animals, in fact, the vast majority of animals, the community is not restricted to the local breeding group, in our case. So, I've mentioned one bit there, that we must have powerful inhibitions against lethal violence. There's another implication, which is that we are extraordinarily sensitive to indications of humanness, particularly in response to the human face. Have you ever noticed in executions, even with groups like ISIS, the victim is hooded, the face is concealed, and the killer comes from behind? There's something about the side of the human face which elicits inhibitions against terrible forms of violence. That's why, by the way, killing up close and personal is psychologically very difficult. Some people, it doesn't bother. But for the vast majority, I would say like 95% of people, excluding the psychopaths, it's traumatic for the killer. It haunts them for a lifetime. So, what goes on there, in my view, is that when we gaze into a human face, like I'm doing with you and you're doing with me, we automatically see human. We can't help it. It's modular. Bang. We can't turn it off. So given that, how can dehumanization happen? Well, here's another fact about human beings. Actually, two facts that are related. One is we've got these great big brains, and that allows us to think instrumentally. We can recognize that there may be tremendous advantages to be reaped by getting rid of those people on the other side of the hill. We can steal their stuff. We can enslave them. We can create Lebensraum for ourselves. That's one half. The other half is what philosophers call the division of cognitive labor. Cumulative culture relies on the existence of experts. Now, I understand expertise in this context as a role. The expert is the person who is supposed to know. They are the specialists. They are the epistemic authorities. So even if what they tell us contradicts what our eyes tell us, it behooves us to accept what they say. So for instance, my favorite example, the microphysicist tells me that this floor is mostly empty space. Doesn't look like it to me. Looks like it's got no gaps at all. But I accept what the microphysicist says. Why? Because the microphysicist is in the position of the person who is supposed to know. Now that's all fine and dandy. But what if the expert is Joseph Goebbels? What if the expert is an American race scientist of the 19th century? What if the expert is Ernst Haeckel. Why should I mention Haeckel? Which button is it? Yay! There's Haeckel. Like I said, probably the most distinguished German biologist of the late 19th century. He's also a eugenicist, by the way. That's another page from one of Haeckel's books, illustrating the great apes. What do we have? Bottom left, orangutan. Top left, chimpanzee. Top right, gorilla. Bottom right, African man. Now, so imagine you're a biology student in, 1886 in Germany, and you open your book and you see this. Who are you to challenge Ernst Haeckel? You are overwhelmingly likely, and in fact, ironically, it's rational for you to do this, to accept what he says. He's the great Ernst Haeckel. So the problem comes, you see, with dehumanization. When people positioned in that way, positioned as authority, and they may be religious leaders, they may be celebrities these days, they may be scientists, they may be anyone accorded that role, tells us that those over there that look human, they aren't really human. They just look human. And so what happens, I think, is this. When people dehumanize people, their minds are pulled in two directions simultaneously. On the one hand, up close and personal, we can't help seeing human. On the other hand, we defer to authorities who tell us otherwise. Epistemic deference. In consequence, we form two contradictory mental representations of the other. The other is wholly human, and the other is wholly subhuman. And this alchemy transforms them into monsters and accounts for the phenomenon I showed you with Maria's discourse, the flipping back and forth, duck-rabbit-like, between characterizing the other as human and characterizing the other as subhuman. And that's the end of my story. Of course, there's a lot more, but this is like the cartoon version. I'm happy to give unsatisfactory responses to questions. Yes, Sue.
Could you go back to the Big Mothers slide?
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask, thank
I'm
you.
probably, yeah. I'm pretty
top
consistent.
Image, is that the artist Patricia Piccini?
It is, yes.
So I recognize her. And
Yeah.
I want to put a shout out. If you ever get the chance to see these sculptures in real life, they are on a human scale. They are profoundly...
She's amazing, yeah.
Yeah, they're profoundly uncanny.
Yeah.
And yeah, in looking at this, and I've read and talked with a lot of people about her work extensively, but I've never seen it paired with the bottom image, which is entirely new to me, so thank you. This is giving me a lot to think about.
Yeah.
But it's also bringing me to, I think, a question that you and I have kind of lived around, but maybe I've never had the chance to ask you point blank before, and that is, how do you define the human?
Oh, that's a very good question. So you ask most people, and they'll say, well, science has told us what human is. It's Homo sapiens. Well, actually, if you look at the scientific literature, that's not always the case at all. So if you look at the literature by paleoanthropologists and sometimes geneticists, sometimes it's genus Homo, sometimes it's Homo sapiens, sometimes it's the subspecies Homo sapiens sapiens, sometimes it's every taxon since the common ancestor with the chimpanzee. It's all over the map. And then if you look further at folk conceptions, sometimes it's the race, sometimes it's the nation, sometimes it's the village. So
And the sex, the gender.
yeah. So what sense do we make of this? Well, I have a particular view. I think the word human works like what philosophers of language call an indexical term. An indexical term is a term the meaning of which is determined by the context of its utterance in a very radical way. So if I say, I'm here, the word here just names the place that the word is uttered. If I say, now I'm here, now just refers to the time that the word is uttered. So what about human? How could that be treated like an indexical term? I think that human means, in practice, my kind, my essential kind. The boundaries of that are obviously quite flexible. You know, if you're Heinrich Himmler, it's human is the Aryan race. That's my kind. But if you're like me, as you probably are, human means our species. Maybe even, actually, if you're like me, it's beyond that, because my dog is human. We call her a person. And she's every bit as, you know, I treat her as every bit as human as any member of species Homo sapiens. So then, when we dehumanize others, to dehumanize others is minimally to think of them as not my essential kind. The essentialism plays an important role in that.
Thank you.
Yay. I thought no one was going to ask me anything.
Thank you. I wanted to ask if you think that there's an idea or a view that could be powerful to inoculate oneself against what appears to be the natural tendency to dehumanize.
No. There's no vaccine. But we can constrain the tendency, right? So I said in the beginning that I think of dehumanization, let me wander again. I think of dehumanization as a psychological response to political forces. Dehumanization happens when these political and social forces exploit certain psychological tendencies that we have and we can't get out of, as far as I can see. But we can act against that. One thing that doesn't work is saying they're human. That's been tried a lot, and it does not work. So here's what I think is about the best we can do. One is learn about ourselves. Any of us can get sucked into this stuff. Any of us, subjected to the right forces. So we have to learn about the psychological propensities that make us vulnerable to these sorts of influences. And that's not what you get in Psychology 101, right? This has got to be very targeted. Let's call it education in human nature. Even though I abhor the term human nature, I'm using it in this context. Second, education in history, real history. Why? Because that inculcates a sense of humility. So, you know, if you learn that we, whoever we are, did this, then you learn, in virtue of that, that we are capable of doing it. Maybe we're doing it now. Maybe we'll do it in the future. So that feeds into vigilance as well. And I will tell you this. For these matters that matter, the students I encounter are incredibly ignorant. Many had never heard of lynching, for instance. So that should be a priority. Those are both kind of educational efforts. They're also political efforts. They're institutions which give us a modicum of protection. Institutions which can be subverted very easily, though. Freedom of speech, a free press, an independent judiciary, things like this. They can be subverted, but they can help. And finally, what I think is most important, and I have to do a little riff to get there. So one of the things I study is propaganda and how propaganda works. And I'm very, very influenced by a paper that was published in 1941 by a man named Roger Monicarl, who was, he had 2 PhDs in philosophy and anthropology and was a practicing psychoanalyst. In 1932, he visited Germany, invited by a friend of his, a diplomat, and he listened to Hitler and Goebbels speak. And he wrote a paper on this, which was published in 1941, called The Psychology of Propaganda. And the bit from the paper, which I think is incredibly valuable, is his observation that what these guys did involved 3 elements. One is getting the audience to feel depressed and hopeless. We were humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles. You know, the communists are taking over. We're the laughingstock of the world. We've let down the fatherland, all that kind of stuff. Then, as Monicarl described it, once they've got the audience rolling around in an orgy of self-pity, then it goes paranoid. Yes, but the enemy is within. It's the Jews. It's the socialists. It's the international bankers. Then the third step is, join me. I'm choosing these words carefully, although they are actually a quotation. I'm choosing them carefully. Only I can make Germany great again. That's the promise of salvation. Now, that can be really enriched. I have to say a little bit more, and I certainly have drawn on this, by Freud's observations in his 1927 paper, The Future of an Illusion, which is ostensibly about the psychology of religion, but was written in a very politically charged atmosphere. And here's what Freud says. Look, part of being human is an awareness, no matter how far in the back you push it, of vulnerability, of what he calls helplessness. And helplessness we find certainly on 2 fronts. There's helplessness in relation to the forces of nature, which will do us all in eventually and will kill everyone we love, and helplessness in the face of injustice. This sense of helplessness, this aching sense of helplessness, sets up a longing for salvation. And religion, and he's particularly targeting Christianity, provides that promise. Well, you're not really going to die. And in the afterlife, unlike in real life, the good folks will be rewarded and the bad folks punished. That solves both problems. So, the skillful propagandist, this goes right with Monicarl's observation, exacerbates the sense of helplessness and then offers salvation. And it's a winning combination. It really is. So back to your question, I think what's extraordinarily important is to structure our societies in such a way that there isn't surplus helplessness, that there's not stuff that these people can use, that people have enough to eat, that they have medical care, that they have jobs, that they're not subject to constant danger of crime, right? Now, it doesn't solve the problem, but it makes it a little bit more difficult for the authoritarian politician to manipulate the public. As an aside, back in 2015, when our former president made his first speech announcing that he was a contender for the Republican nomination. Listening to that speech, I became very, very worried. If you listen to it, you'll find it follows the playbook I've just described to the letter. And, you know, I gave talks about this, I wrote about it, I put endless messages on social media, and my progressive friends just patted me on my head and said, silly boy, it's just a joke, you know, he'll never get it. It's powerful stuff. So, long-winded response, but you gave me an opportunity to say some things. Lay.
What do you think about taking one more question here and then we move the conversation?
Okay, sounds good. Yeah.
Hey, Dave, I'm sorry I had to ask this question. What's your feeling about next year's election?
Someone asked me, so each year I attend a closed meeting called Security and Human Behavior. It's for people in security industries, mostly cybersecurity and some sort of anti-terrorist people. And the organizers like a mixed audience, so they have like a couple of philosophers, a couple of psychologists, the oddball. I've been invited since its inception, like 13, 14 years ago. One of the organizers asked me, and this was a few years ago, what's my prediction about Donald Trump? And I said, choosing my words carefully, I think he will serve at least one more term. And that's what I'm concerned about the upcoming election. So, vote. Please vote.
Please join me in thanking David for a nice talk.
Thank you. So bad I couldn't get the clicker button right.